15th of April 1989. Anybody who remembers that day will be reminded that it was a beautiful, warm spring day, a bit like today, only warmer. It was the FA Cup semi-final, one of the most important games of the season. And in those days, they weren't played at Wembley. They were played at neutral stadiums, stadiums that the fans were not really that familiar with. It was at Hillsborough, Liverpool against Nottingham Forest, a rerun of the previous year. As ever, people travelled by coach and train, private cars. What a lot of people don't know is that en route, the coaches were pulled over by the police. The coaches were searched. Individuals were searched. When they arrived in Sheffield, the coaches went to a designated area. The phrase that's used in the police document for the day is a word that we usually use for animals. Fans were corralled, and they were led to the stadium. When they arrived at the stadium, and we have to remember that these grounds were Victorian grounds, the area they walked into was a small car park type area. Believe it or not, the turnstiles in that area, not that much wider than this theatre, the turnstiles had to feed 3 areas of the ground: the Leppings Lane Terrace, the Leppings Lane Stand, and the side, one of the sides of the ground. There was no filtering, no stewarding outside. By 2:30, half an hour before the kickoff, it was packed. And the approach roads were packed. The turnstiles were old, decrepit. 2 of them weren't even working. So you can imagine the compression at the turnstiles as people were trying to move forward but couldn't. And there was no stewarding of the crowds. The police decided they would open an exit gate, Gate C, which was around the side of the ground. And fans were peeled off the back and walked in through Gate C, an exit gate, into a stadium that they weren't familiar with. Opposite them, there was an arch. Above the arch, it read "Standing." And what that standing area was a 1 in 6 gradient tunnel, illegal, actually, into the back of 2 central pens. 1 pen holding 1,000, 1 pen holding 1,100. Already those pens were almost full. So fans, oblivious to knowing where they were going, walked down to the tunnel into the back of already full central pens. They couldn't walk back once they realized they were full because they couldn't get back up the tunnel. Penned to the sides by high fences with spikes, penned to the front by high fences with spikes, and a wall at the back. That is what it looked like at 3 o'clock as the game kicked off. You can see how absolutely packed tight those central pens are. People are already losing consciousness. And you can see there's a gathering outside of people shouting at the police to open the 2 mini gates, one at the front of each pen. That's where 97 people eventually lost their lives, where many other people have lost their lives prematurely as a result of the suffering of Hillsborough, both physical and mental. I'd like us to pause just for a few moments in silence to remember those who died at Hillsborough. Thank you. The crush, said Eddie Spirit, right in the centre of the pen. Like a vice getting tighter and tighter and tighter, I turned Adam, his son, round to me in distress. There was a police officer on the track about 5 or 6 feet away. I begged him to open the gate, screaming, "My lovely son is dying," begging him to help. He just stood and looked at me. I punched the fence. Right at the beginning, when I was begging the officer to open the gate, I could have got Adam out. I know, because I was there. Eddie also lost consciousness and was left for dead. He regained consciousness later in the evening, and Eddie remarkably lived on until, and his family won't mind me saying this, the early onset of Alzheimer's. A campaigner for Adam, a campaigner for all who died. This is the next day. Some of you will realize that is the familiar face of Margaret Thatcher. She is actually pointing at the control box, which was adjacent to the terrace. That's the point at which she was being told by the chief constable, who is in her left ear. She is being told what happened. There is also the Home Secretary, Douglas Hurd, also the Sports Minister for Sports, and several other senior officers. How can I be so sure that she was told the lie of Hillsborough? This is how. I visited Hillsborough on the morning after the disaster. I know what I learned on the spot. There would have been no Hillsborough if a mob who were clearly tanked up had not tried to force their way into the ground. To blame the police is a cop-out. I see no purpose in addressing an organisation, he's talking about the family support group, which is incapable of accepting this simple fact. This is Sir Bernard Ingham, and you can see how close he is to Margaret Thatcher. He's standing behind the chief constable. That's the spot where he learned the truth as he saw it and the lie as I interpreted it. And it was disseminated. Within days, any newspaper coverage that had been empathetic towards the fans changed. Up to 40 people died in the tunnel. The rest were trampled underfoot. No one died in the tunnel. Thousands of fans began the fatal charge. Latecomers tried to force their way into the ground. Untrue. The Anfield Army charged the terrace, many without tickets. Untrue. In actual fact, when the count was done, when we were on the panel, and we were able to count, literally using modern technology, how many people were in the stadium, it was 1,000 less than capacity. A catastrophe caused by violent enthusiasm. Tribal passions of Liverpool supporters literally kill themselves. Just ponder for a moment on the use of these words, tribal. Gate crashers wreaked their fatal havoc. In our own newspaper, this. Uncontrolled fanaticism, mass hysteria. Scouse killed Scouse. For those of you who remember this time, remember that the media didn't let up. And the lie consolidated. On the 19th of April, the newspapers nationally now ran these headlines and first lines. Dead fans robbed by drunk thugs. Vile fans fought us, that means the police, as we tried to help the dying. Police accused drunken fans, the sick spectacle of pilfering from the dying. Liverpool pickpockets pounced on the dead, suggesting that as people were laid out on the ground, people pickpocketed those who were already dead. Heavy drinking fans besieged the ground. I'll deal with that later. But of course, as many of you know, the worst headline came from Kelvin Mackenzie. The truth. Fans pickpockets of victims, urinated on the brave cops, and beat up a PC giving the kiss of life. His own political editor said the evening before this was published, "Are you sure you want to run with this story?" And he said he was sure. And now, within 4 days of the disaster, we have a narrative that is internationally known. And it continued. And it wasn't just newspapers. Brian Clough was the Nottingham Forest manager on the day at Hillsborough. Imagine saying this when people have died and they're suffering from serious injuries. Liverpool people kill Liverpool people. Half can't read, and the other half are out pinching hubcaps. Simon Heffer, a really highly regarded writer in the Sunday Telegraph, for Liverpool fans killed by the thuggishness and ignorance of other Liverpool fans. Jonathan Margolis, usually a rights-inspired journalist, self-pity city. Liverpool culture seems to combine defeatism and hollow-cheeked depression with a cloying mawkishness. We've now gone from fans dying in a stadium to an attack on the city, the region, and its people. And Auburn War, some of you will say, well, we'd expect it of him. Auburn War, Liverpool's unemployment is due to stupidity, the unpleasant habits of the people, the clever people left long ago. You can see how the narrative is building here. And it infected the legal proceedings. I was involved immediately in the aftermath of Hillsborough, and I'd set up the Hillsborough Independent Research Group based here at Edge Hill, where I was a professor and head of department. Judicial Inquiry Interim Report came out in August 1989. Unspectacularly, it stated the cause was overcrowding. The reason, however, was a failure in policing. And specifically, Taylor stated that senior officers failed in their leadership expected of their rank. Then, his full report came out, and he hardly mentioned Hillsborough. He concentrated on Heysel. And I now know, but he never lived long enough for me to be able to confront him with it, that he had said he felt he'd gone too far in his interim report. The formal investigations, 1989 to 1990, no prosecutions, no disciplinary actions, and the West Midlands Police, whose entire serious crime squad was actually on garden leave because of the investigation that was going on into their handling of the Irish cases in the Midlands. The West Midlands Police were appointed as the so-called independent scrutineers of what had happened at Hillsborough. And the inquest began in 1990 and ended in 1991. There was partial evidence. And you can imagine what it was like when you had one barrister representing the families and multiple barristers representing all the different interests that thought that they may be held accountable. At the end, the coroner directed towards an accidental death verdict. He was assisted by the West Midlands Police, and that was the verdict that the jury, on a majority, returned. The persistent failure continued. Working with the families, we put forward, 6 of the families put forward a judicial review of the inquest verdicts, and 3 senior High Court judges ruled That, and the word they used, was the inquest had been impeccable. A judicial scrutiny of any new evidence was set up by the new Labour government in 1997. And again, even though I gave evidence, took families with me, took police witnesses with me, Lord Justice Stuart Smith, the former MI5 commissioner, he ruled that the new evidence amounted to nothing, that everything would stand as was. A private prosecution was taken by the families 1999 to 2000, and it failed. Meanwhile, here at Edge Hill, the Hillsborough Project had been founded. In 1990, we produced our first report, the Hillsborough and After, the Liverpool Experience, following interviews with multiple families and survivors. When that didn't seem to shake the foundations, we published the second report, No Less Rights, a major report into the family's experiences throughout. Jimmy McGovern, informed by this, he was the first person to purchase a copy of the first report, with the wonderful Katie Jones as researcher. The late Katie Jones actually ran the Hillsborough film. Now, what we were doing locally, make no bones about it, academics don't have an international reach. What we were doing locally now went round the world in 90 minutes or thereabouts. And it was at this time that I came in one night, and you know when you're channel hopping? And this guy was sitting in a chair, long ponytail, in front of a buckled barrier at Hillsborough. I thought, what's this? He was a police officer from the South Yorkshire Police. And he told a totally different story to that being told by the police. He'd now left the police, and he felt free to talk. It took me a while to track him down, and when I did, I left Burscough, where I lived, and drove across to Yorkshire and went for a walk on the moors. He told me that in the immediate aftermath, what happened was a team of police officers appointed by the South Yorkshire Police, those who would be held responsible. That team of police officers were instructed to go through all police handwritten statements. They'd only been asked to handwrite their statements, have them typed up. And when they were typed up, they were to go through those typed statements and to go back to the police officers and suggest review and alteration of the statements. This was like the conspiracies that you used to think about, and you go, no, that wouldn't happen. It did. This is just a page from David's statement. You can see how now it's been typed up and the lines are through. There are 96 by coincidence, sentences in that statement removed. And then it was typed up and signed. And here it is. I thought I was unshockable at this point. And I said to David, I can see that's a changed statement. But come on, mate. Your signature's at the bottom of every page. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, Phil, it is my signature, but I never put it there. That's the moment when I decided in 12 weeks to write the first edition of Hillsborough the Truth. I set myself a task of a chapter a week. Of course, I'd had 10 years of gathering material and evidence, but even by my standards, that was a difficult ask. I failed by 12 weeks, but I beat the guys who were slating the church behind where I lived. I beat them by a good month. I'll never forget the looks on their faces when I went over and told them while you've been slating that church, I've written the book. And they looked at me as if I was just some crazy guy, which I probably was. What I did in that book, was I demonstrated that Hillsborough had to be placed in context, the historical context of crowd control versus crowd safety, the neglect of crowd control, the negligent response to the fatal crush, and the failure in something we would all expect. In this building right now, that there is a duty of care for our safety. Catastrophic delay in rescue and evacuation. People who died could have been saved. And then the vindictive treatment of the bereaved and survivors in the immediate aftermath. I called this a tragedy out of a disaster. What do I mean about vindictive treatment? Imagine going to view the body of your child. You view the body, you identify the body, you bend down to kiss, hug the body, and you're pulled back. I'm sorry, you cannot touch the body. He or she is now the property of the coroner. And then they were led to the other end of the gymnasium where this was occurring, and they sat at desks, tables, and across the desk would be 2 police officers. And the questioning went along the lines of, has he got any convictions? Has she ever been in trouble at school? Those questions were leveled on the night, in the minutes after identification. And they were leveled by members of the South Yorkshire Police themselves. Out of this, I was able to demonstrate very clearly how the media had fabricated stories and how they'd developed a climate of hostility. I examined why there had been no disciplinary action and no prosecution, but I also, at that time, I'd been experienced in inquests, and what I couldn't understand was the coroner had imposed a 3:15 cutoff on all who died. Because what he said was, all of those who died would have had injuries inflicted from which they were not recoverable. Therefore, no evidence in terms of the rescue and evacuation of getting people out, getting people across the pitch on hoardings, getting people into ambulances, getting people to hospital. No evidence was taken. None of those people were ever interviewed. And of course, what I was able to show was the police statements had been reviewed and altered. I don't use the word corruption lightly. I live in the north of Ireland. You don't throw words like corruption around unless you have proof. This was a systemic corruption of evidence, without any question. Who knew? I was lying in bed one night and barrel of laughs and you're just dropping off to sleep and your partner's asleep. And she tells me that I sat bolt upright. I just remember sitting in the bed, shouting, they all knew. What I was able to show was the South Yorkshire Police solicitors, Hammond Suddards, knew. The West Midlands Police Investigation Team knew. Lord Justice Taylor knew. The coroner knew. The Treasury solicitor knew. Both officials and ministers at the Home Office knew. And the Stuart Smith scrutiny knew. And I knew Stuart Smith knew because I went previously and prevented the evidence. This was justice denied. It was just around this time that I was planning to leave. And 2 years later, I left Burscough, I left Edgehill, and I went to live in the north of Ireland, where I've continued my work on a range of other issues, but Hillsborough has always been close. And I've worked on Hillsborough with the families, with the survivors ever since. But I called 2000 to 2009 the lost decade because nothing happened except the bereaved and survivors continued campaigning. and the 15th of April was the moment of ultimate campaign. 2010, the Labour government set up the Hillsborough Independent Panel. This had been campaigned for by the Hillsborough Family Support Group. And the Hillsborough Independent Panel was set up to say that they were to look into what newly gathered evidence would add to public understanding. That's a story in its own right. It lasted 2 years. I headed the research for the Hillsborough Independent Panel. And I brought onto the panel some of the great inquisitorial minds, one of whom, Raju Bhatt, and Katie Jones. She made a reappearance, this time as a researcher for the panel. After 2 years, we presented our findings that there had been a clear and present danger at all levels, right across the stadium, that a risk was known and it was run, that the emergency response by the ambulance service had been poorly executed, that the pathology had contaminated the evidence, and they misrepresented crush asphyxia when all the experts that I was consulting had said that people probably died of traumatic asphyxia. In other words, they said that they said that they died of crush asphyxia when they had presented the evidence as traumatic asphyxia, that it was a sudden crush and they went, and their chest wall would not release. That was what was stated absolutely clearly. Crush asphyxia takes time. You asphyxiate over time. And that was the reality. One of the most stunning findings was when Bill Kirkup, he was regional director of health and he was on the panel, came over to Northern Ireland and we sat in our kitchen and he said, "We've got a problem here." And I said, "What?" He said, "Everything demonstrates that 41 of those who died lived beyond 3:15 and could have been saved." He also demonstrated that alcohol played no part in terms of the pathology. Most offensively, we discovered that all who died had had criminal record checks run on them, including children. The inquests we demonstrated were flawed for the reasons I've already mentioned. And now we discovered that not only were the South Yorkshire Police statements reviewed and altered, but the ambulance service statements had been reviewed and altered. And I also discovered that in that week immediately after the disaster, White's news agency in Sheffield, who handled all of the news for Sheffield Wednesday Football Club, had met with police officers from the South Yorkshire Police, and the narrative that they published was the narrative that the South Yorkshire Police promoted. That was why so many national newspapers went with the story. Let me just explain a second. How did this happen? The 19th of April, there was a police federation meeting. This is one of 20-odd pages. I got access to all of this material. Chief constables never go to police federation meetings. It's a union. He went to this one. He said, and this is a quote, "Putting our side of the story to the press and media couldn't come from him. The defence had to be put forward that would present a rock-solid story, pulled together and given to the press and the inquiry. If we sat back and let them collect the evidence, we would lose it. We have to do it ourselves. If anyone should be blamed," he said, "it should be the drunken, ticketless individuals." Again, I say that I'm not easily shocked. But not only was this said, it was recorded. And what I then discovered was that a few days after the disaster, a chief superintendent, there were 6 of them actually, took us out for a drink And he said to us, unless we get our heads together and straighten it out, there are heads going to roll. The criminalisation of the dead. I'm only picking out 3 of the key elements. On the evening, South Yorkshire Police interviewed the bereaved. The bereaved said, as I mentioned before, that they felt they were being interrogated. The day after, the South Yorkshire Police searched the routes into Sheffield. They went to all the litter bins in the lay-bys and they looked for beer cans and bottles. They could have come from anybody, but they were trying to gather evidence that Liverpool fans had arrived drunk. The coroner had immediately ordered the taking of blood alcohols on the night of the disaster, and as I've said, those with discernible blood alcohol levels had criminal records checks run on them. You can't read this, you just have to take my word for it. These are the checks. I have these documents in my possession. They give the name of the person, the date of birth, and whether or not there was any trace of alcohol in their blood. And what I'm showing you here is what I eventually got my hands on, which were all of the police statements in all of the forms. I went down to the House of Lords reading room where they were delivered to me in 12 large lawyery type boxes. They were packed. They were in no order. It took me 2 days to sort them out into the 3 or 4 versions of the statement. These are the final statements of 2 officers who are in the same serial, the same group. And everything in pink is absolutely word for word duplicated. Not only were those statements reviewed and altered, they were duplicated also. And one of my colleagues at the University of Utrecht, who's a linguist specialist, is actually working on that material as I talk. All of the statements had gone through that process of those officers who were in the vicinity of where the crush occurred. The impact of the independent panel report, even by my own anticipation, was remarkable. We went to the Anglican Cathedral and I delivered the report to all of the families and to the survivors in adjacent rooms. And I went through all of our findings, as I've just done, much more than I have, 157 key findings. While I was talking and showing my slides, I could hear the sobbing in the hall. Immediately, while I was still in the hall and the families were still there, David Cameron got up in the House of Commons in front of a packed House of Commons and issued an apology for the double injustice. The injustice of the investigation in the first place and the injustice of the cover-up. There was then mounted what was called the IPCC, now IOPC investigation into the South Yorkshire Police and the West Midlands Police role in the cover-up. That, as I've said, is still ongoing. Operation Resolve was established as an independent police inquiry into criminal culpability. That has now ended. On the 19th of December 2012, the Lord Chief Justice announced that all the inquisitions will be quashed and there will be new inquests in every case. So I move to the inquests, the verdicts, and beyond. As I've said already, the new inquests were held 2013 through to 2016, and my university allowed me to be on half-time secondment to work with the legal teams. The coroner's summing up usually takes half a day maximum in a contested case, lasted from February to April, and the jury heard that summing up. They'd sat through those 2 years. The verdict they came to was not accidental death. And you have a set verdict, and the most serious is unlawful killing. And that is what they returned. But these days, after our campaign years earlier on other cases, there is also a narrative verdict added. They're allowed to tell a story. They're not allowed to indicate directly liability. They found 25 contributory factors against the police, the stadium owners, the safety engineers, the local authority, and the ambulance workers. Most of those were directed towards the police. But the question that came, did the fans play any part in the disaster? They were exonerated. They played no part. The criminal investigation went on, and my book, the new editions of Hillsborough the Truth, was not allowed to be sold during this period for 3 years while the criminal investigation went on, in case there would be prejudicing the outcome. The IPCC had now changed into the IOPC, the Independent Office of Police Conduct, and that was established in 2012, and that's still ongoing. So, what is the legacy of Hillsborough? The legacy of Hillsborough is a legal duty of candour on public authorities and officials to tell the truth and proactively cooperate with official investigations and inquiries. Bereaved families' entitlement to public funding, ensuring parity of legal representation during inquests and inquiries, and a public advocate to support the bereaved in the aftermath of mass casualty incidents or occurrences leading to multiple deaths. And with my partner, Dina Hayden, we have worked with Ian Byrne, the MP, and with his team here in Merseyside to take forward the Public Accountability Bill. This is the Real Truth Legacy Project, to educate current and future generations about the injustice and establishment of the Hillsborough cover-up, how the establishment covered it up. Why are we doing that? I think after the post office scandal, you don't really need to be told why. But of course, Hillsborough was football fans. Post office workers, post office managers, post office people running the post offices in our areas, they're part of our community. There's less sympathy for football supporters, but hopefully not any longer. And now we're taking Hillsborough into the national curriculum. It's already going into the Merseyside curriculum. Of course, many teachers weren't even born or were very young at the time of Hillsborough, so we have to be careful how we're developing this. So Dina and I are working on the school's version of Hillsborough the Truth. And we're accompanying it with a political education, I don't like the word, toolkit, a guide, a way in which that material can be delivered. What is this all about? I've stood in this institution many times and talked about the significance and importance of the view from below. The view from below is us, citizens. The view from below rarely gets heard. What it is about is bearing witness. My work is about bearing witness, taking an inquiring mind into any issue and bearing witness. The mother and baby institutions in the north of Ireland, or more recently, well, that's recent, but more recently in terms of football, in terms of what happened in Paris. And in what happened in Paris, Dina has interviewed and taken forward so many of the experiences of children and young people. That is taking what C. Wright Mills called personal troubles and turning them into public issues. It's about truth recovery, and I don't need to say much more living in the north of Ireland. It's about building alternative accounts to those which come through official discourse. It's about challenging the deceit of that discourse. What we've said many years ago, establish a fundamental shift in the relations and context of power that marginalize and exclude citizens from effective participation in their societies. We think we are participants, but on what basis of knowledge? And I'm taken back to Ariel Dorfman, writing in Chile after the coup by the Pinochet colonels. And so many people had been taken and killed, tortured, hidden. Babies had been taken and given away. In 2000, Ariel Dorfman said, "They found a way of speaking out. The men and women whose voices have now reached us decided that they could not live with themselves if they did nothing. They could not stain their lives by remaining silent. They understood that if they witnessed this suffering inflicted on themselves or on others and did nothing, they were, in some twisted way, being turned into accomplices. They had to face the long nights when it seemed nobody cared." I've spoken to so many Hillsborough families who use that phrase. "When the darkness of apathy seemed to surround them, when their voices did not seem to receive the echo and the answer that they needed." That is what our work has been dedicated to, the echo and the answer. And today, after the 35th anniversary, I want us to celebrate the memory of the 97 men, women, and children who were killed at Hillsborough, the suffering of the bereaved, the survivors, the rescuers, and those who have died prematurely due to their loss and trauma. If ever the words "you never walk alone" mean anything, it has been the last 35 years, and we must continue that support from here on in. Thank you.